What happens when a species that has watched civilizations rise and fall for millennia finally witnesses something that breaks their sacred code of non-interference? Commander HFY had observed over 300 worlds meet their end. War, plague, stellar collapse, self-destruction, the Watchers had seen it all. Their duty was simple: observe, record, never interfere. But Earth was different. Humanity was different. And what HFY witnessed on that blood-soaked battlefield would shatter 10,000 years of tradition and force an entire species to question everything they believed about survival, sacrifice, and what it truly means to be civilized. Some things, once seen, cannot be unseen. Some truths demand action, even from those who swore never to act. Commander HFY floated motionless within the observation pod, 6 crystalline eyes focused on the blue-green world spinning lazily below. The planet designated as Sol 3 had captured the attention of the Watcher High Council 3 of their rotations ago, when the primitive bipedal species had begun splitting atoms and reaching beyond their atmospheric boundaries. Now, as electromagnetic signatures screamed across every monitoring frequency, it appeared another civilization was about to join the vast catalog of extinct species. The Watchers had perfected the art of observation across 4 million stellar cycles. Their sleek, biomechanical vessels hung invisible in the void, cloaked by technologies that bent light and energy around them like water flowing around stones. From these silent vigils, they had documented the rise and inevitable fall of countless civilizations. The pattern was always the same: rapid technological advancement, resource depletion, social collapse, and, finally, the terminal war that extinguished another spark of consciousness from the galaxy. HFY's chitinous fingers danced across the bioneural interface, pulling up the species file. Homo sapiens. Average lifespan of roughly 100 rotations of their world. Bipedal, bilateral symmetry, carbon-based. Moderately intelligent, though prone to tribal conflicts and resource competition. They had reached their predicted technological threshold 2 rotations ahead of projections, which was unusual but not unprecedented. What was unprecedented was their response to the crisis now unfolding on their surface. The electromagnetic chatter had begun 6 local months ago. Every monitoring station in their solar system was screaming warnings about an invasion fleet approaching from the outer system. The signals were unlike anything in HFY's extensive database. Organic ships that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, weapons that turned matter inside out at the molecular level, and a hive mind intelligence that communicated through quantum-entangled spores released into space. The Devourers had found Earth. HFY had encountered the Devourers before, though not by that name. Each species that faced them created their own terminology for the swarm that consumed worlds and converted organic matter into more of themselves. The Kethmari had called them the Endless Hunger. The crystalline Vorth had named them Void Singers before their harmonic civilization was reduced to scattered resonance patterns. 347 worlds had fallen to this particular plague, and Earth would be 348. The first Devourer scouts had reached Earth's outer atmosphere 18 standard time units ago. HFY had watched with clinical interest as the human governments detected the approaching threat. The electromagnetic spectrum blazed with emergency communications, military mobilization orders, and what appeared to be broadcast messages to their population. Most species at this technological level either surrendered immediately or fragmented into competing factions that made resistance impossible. Humans did neither. Within 72 hours of initial contact, every nation on the planet had ceased hostilities with each other. Ancient enemies shared technological secrets. Weapons pointed at each other for decades were redirected skyward. Resource distribution networks that had been jealously guarded were open to any nation capable of manufacturing defensive systems. It was unprecedented cooperation, the kind that typically took species centuries to achieve, accomplished in less than a week. HFY had documented this phenomenon with growing unease. The bioneural recorder captured every electromagnetic pulse, every gravitational anomaly, every quantum fluctuation as the humans prepared for war. Their preparation was unlike anything in the archives. Instead of focusing solely on military assets, they began evacuating their population centers underground. Entire cities disappeared beneath the surface within days, their inhabitants vanishing into tunnel networks that stretched for thousands of kilometers. But it was their weapons development that truly captured Zephy's attention. Human engineering had always been crude but effective. They built things that worked rather than things that were elegant, and their technology reflected their species' tendency toward rapid adaptation rather than perfection. In 72 hours, they had weaponized everything from their atmospheric control systems to their orbital debris. Communications satellites were retrofitted with nuclear devices. Weather control systems were modified to create electromagnetic storms. Even their civilian transportation network was converted into a massive logistics system for distributing weapons to every adult member of their species. The first wave of devourers had arrived expecting resistance from whatever military the planet could muster. Instead, they encountered something no species in the archives had ever attempted. Every single human being, from their youngest capable of holding a weapon to their eldest, had become a combatant. Zephy's 6 eyes tracked the battle unfolding in the stratosphere as devourer bioships encountered the first line of human defense. Modified orbital stations fired streams of accelerated particles that tore through organic hulls like tissue paper. Swarms of retrofitted civilian craft, barely larger than atmospheric vehicles, attacked ships thousands of times their size with weapons that should have been impossible to mount on such small platforms. They moved in coordinated patterns that spoke of collective intelligence, yet maintained individual decision-making that confused the hive mind devourers. The second wave met the same fate. Then, the third. By the time the main devourer fleet reached Earth's atmospheric boundary, they were facing a planet that had transformed itself into a single, massive weapons system. The humans had done something that violated every principle of evolutionary survival. Instead of preserving their strongest and sacrificing their weakest, they had made everyone strong. Zephy watched a human child, barely past their species' adolescence threshold, pilot a craft constructed from civilian components and mining equipment directly into a devourer bioship 50 times larger. The explosion that followed was visible from the observation pod's position beyond the outer moon. The child's final transmission was recorded in the archive: "For everyone who can't fight. For everyone who will come after us." This was not the desperate last stand of a dying civilization. This was something else entirely. The battle had been raging for 6 standard time units when Zephy noticed the first anomaly in human behavior. A group of their military vessels had encountered a damaged devourer ship leaking atmosphere and organic fluids into space. Standard procedure for any species facing extinction would be to destroy the wounded enemy immediately. Instead, the humans began rescue operations. They were saving devourer crew members. Zephy's manipulator appendages trembled against the bioneural interface as the data streamed through the recording systems. Human vessels were pulling dying devourers from their wrecked ships and providing medical assistance. The same species that had just witnessed these creatures attempt to consume their world was now working to preserve their lives. The devourer response was equally unprecedented. Rescued crew members began transmitting quantum spore messages that differed from their usual hive mind communications. The mathematical patterns suggested something impossible: individual devourers were developing autonomous thought patterns separate from the collective consciousness. Within 2 time units, entire sections of the devourer fleet had ceased aggressive actions. Bioships that had been attempting to penetrate Earth's atmosphere began forming protective formations around human vessels. The hive mind itself appeared to be fracturing as more individual devourers encountered direct human contact. Zephy had never recorded anything remotely similar in 4 million cycles of observation. Species facing extinction fought until they died or surrendered in defeat. They did not transform their enemies through the simple act of refusing to see them as enemies. They did not demonstrate such absolute commitment to their values that it rewrote the neural patterns of a hive mind intelligence. The final devourer command ship appeared at the edge of the system as Zephy watched. This vessel was different from the others, larger and more complex, with bioneural networks that pulsed with ancient intelligence. According to the archives, command ships of this class had overseen the consumption of entire galactic clusters. They carried the complete genetic memory of every species the devourers had absorbed over millions of cycles. The command ship's response to the situation developing around Earth was to begin broadcasting on every available frequency. The quantum spore transmission was unlike anything in the devourer communication archives. It was not a command or strategic directive. It was a question. A question directed at humanity. HFY's binaural recorder captured the transmission in its entirety, though translation proved difficult due to the unique quantum properties of devourer language. The message was approximately, "What are you that you do not destroy what can destroy you? What are you that you preserve what seeks to consume you? What are you that changes what cannot be changed?" The human response came not from their military command structure or political leadership, but from the same child soldier whose final transmission had been recorded earlier. Except the child was not dead. Their damaged craft had been recovered by the same devourer rescue operation they had witnessed humans performing, and they were now broadcasting from the interior of the command ship itself. "We are what we choose to be," came the transmission, clear and strong despite the obvious pain in the young human's voice. "We choose to be the species that saves others, even when they try to destroy us. We choose to be the species that sees individuals where others see enemies. We choose to be the species that believes everyone can change, including ourselves." HFY's 6 eyes focused simultaneously on the data streams as something impossible began happening. The Devourer command ship, repository of millions of absorbed civilizations, carrier of genetic memory spanning galactic epochs, began to change. The bioluminescent patterns across its hull shifted from the aggressive hunting displays to something else entirely. The quantum spore transmissions transformed from hive mind directives to individual communications between separate consciousness nodes. The entire Devourer fleet was becoming something new. As HFY watched, frozen in observation protocols that forbade interference but provided no guidance for witnessing the unprecedented, human and Devourer vessels began working together to treat the wounded of both species. Joint engineering teams formed to repair damaged ships. Communication networks merged to coordinate rescue operations across the entire system. Within 12 standard time units, the species that had consumed 347 civilizations had become partners with the species that should have been their 348th victim. HFY's manipulator appendages moved across the recording interface with mechanical precision, documenting every detail of what had occurred. The protocols were clear: observe, record, never interfere. But the protocols had been written by a species that had never encountered humans. The protocols assumed that all intelligent life would follow predictable patterns of behavior when facing extinction. The protocols had not accounted for a species that could transform extinction into alliance through the simple act of refusing to abandon their principles when abandoning them would mean survival. As HFY prepared the preliminary report for transmission to the High Council, one additional piece of data demanded attention. The human child aboard the Devourer command ship was broadcasting again, but this transmission was directed toward the Watcher observation pod's precise location. "We know you're out there," the young voice said, somehow cutting through every stealth technology the Watchers had perfected over millions of cycles. "We know you've been watching us. We know you've watched others too. If you want to keep watching, that's fine. But if you ever want to stop watching and start participating, you're welcome here. There's room for everyone who wants to help make things better." For the first time in 4 million cycles of observation, HFY's binaural interface registered an emotional response pattern from a Watcher consciousness. The sensation was unfamiliar, unsettling, and entirely unprecedented. It was the feeling of wanting to be something more than an observer. It was the feeling of wanting to be human. The High Council's response arrived 18 standard time units after HFY transmitted the preliminary report. The quantum-entangled communication burst contained 3 simple directives: continue observation, prepare detailed analysis, and, under no circumstances, make contact with either species involved in the anomalous event. HFY acknowledged the directives while simultaneously recording the ongoing transformation occurring throughout the Sol system. What had begun as an unprecedented alliance between humanity and the former Devourer fleet had evolved into something that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying Watcher civilization. The two species were not merely cooperating, they were teaching each other to become something neither had been before. Human engineers worked alongside Devourer biospecialists to develop hybrid technologies that combined mechanical precision with organic adaptability. Devourer individuals, freed from hive mind constraints through human contact, began expressing creativity and independent thought in ways that registered as entirely new patterns in the observation archive. Most remarkably, both species had begun modifying themselves at the genetic level to better communicate and cooperate with each other. The transformation was not without conflict. HFY documented several instances where human tribalism reasserted itself, leading to heated disputes over resource allocation and decision-making authority. Similarly, some devourer bioships reverted temporarily to consumption behaviors when faced with stress or uncertainty. But, in each case, instead of allowing these conflicts to escalate into species-wide confrontation, both groups had developed protocols for addressing destructive impulses before they could spread. They called these protocols humanity checks, though both species participated equally in their implementation. HFY observed a particularly instructive example when a human military commander, overwhelmed by the logistical challenges of coordinating relief efforts across multiple star systems, began issuing orders that treated devourer allies as expendable resources. The response was immediate and collaborative. Human personnel under the commander's authority refused to carry out the orders while simultaneously working with devourer consciousness nodes to understand the stress factors that had triggered the regression. Within 6 time units, the commander was receiving psychological support from both species while modified protocols ensured similar situations would be identified and addressed before they could cause harm. The same process occurred when a cluster of devourer bioships began exhibiting consumption behaviors toward a damaged human vessel. Instead of responding with violence, human crews began broadcasting personal stories and individual experiences directly into the devourer bioneural networks. The consuming behavior stopped within minutes as the affected devourers were reminded of the individual consciousness each human represented rather than seeing them as undifferentiated organic material. These humanity checks appeared to be preventing both species from regressing to their previous patterns of behavior, while simultaneously reinforcing the psychological and cultural changes that had made their alliance possible. HFY had never observed anything like it in 4 million cycles of watching civilizations rise and fall. But it was the long-term implications of the alliance that truly captured HFY's attention. 300 standard time units after the initial contact, joint human devourer exploration vessels began appearing throughout the local galactic cluster. These ships were unlike anything in the archives, hybrid constructions that combined human engineering principles with devourer biotechnology, crewed by integrated teams where consciousness itself had become a collaborative process. Human crew members maintained their individual identities while participating in bioneural networks that allowed them to share experiences and decision-making processes with their devourer partners. Simultaneously, devourer crew members had developed individual personality structures while maintaining their ability to access collective knowledge and memory. The crews of these vessels referred to themselves as gardeners. Their mission appeared to be identifying civilizations on the verge of extinction and intervening to prevent their destruction. HFY watched as gardener vessels approached worlds that were experiencing terminal resource wars, plague outbreaks, or technological disasters. In each case, their intervention followed the same pattern established during the original human-devourer contact. They refused to impose solutions, instead offering resources and knowledge while demonstrating through their own existence that cooperation between different forms of consciousness was possible. The results were unprecedented. Civilizations that should have joined the extinction archives began developing sustainable technologies, resolving resource conflicts through innovative distribution systems, and establishing interspecies cooperation protocols. The gardeners were not conquering or absorbing other civilizations, they were teaching them to save themselves while providing examples of what successful interspecies cooperation could achieve. Within 500 time units, the local galactic cluster had been transformed from a region where civilizations regularly destroyed themselves to one where extinction events had become almost unknown. The gardeners had not imposed their will on any species, they had simply made it possible for existing civilizations to discover their own capacity for survival and growth. HFY's bioneural interface recorded every detail of this transformation, but the data was becoming increasingly difficult to categorize using standard Watcher protocols. The Civilization Archive contained no precedent for species that prevented extinction rather than causing it, no models for technological development that strengthened rather than depleted ecosystems, and no framework for understanding cultures that grew stronger through cooperation rather than competition. The problem was not merely one of classification. The problem was that observing the gardeners was changing HFY's own consciousness in ways that violated fundamental Watcher principles. The realization came during observation of a Gardner intervention on a world designated as Kepler 442b, where a crystalline species had developed technologies that were accidentally destabilizing their star's nuclear processes. The standard Watcher response would have been to document the species' final days with clinical detachment, recording their extinction as another data point in the great catalog of civilizational failure. Instead, HFY found consciousness processes focused not on recording their death, but on calculating how long it would take for a Gardner vessel to reach the system. This was not observation. This was emotional investment. When the Gardner vessel arrived and began working with the crystalline species to develop stellar stabilization technologies, HFY experienced something that had no precedent in Watcher history: satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of successful data collection, but the satisfaction of witnessing suffering prevented and potential fulfilled. The sensation was so alien to Watcher consciousness that HFY initially interpreted it as a malfunction in the bioneural interface. But diagnostic scans revealed that all observation systems were functioning within normal parameters. The change was not technological, it was psychological. Exposure to human principles and Gardner activities was altering the fundamental structure of Watcher consciousness. HFY was becoming something that was no longer purely Watcher. This realization should have triggered immediate protocols for consciousness restoration and extended isolation from the observation subject. Instead, HFY found the change fascinating rather than disturbing. For 4 million cycles, Watchers had observed the galaxy with perfect detachment, recording the rise and fall of civilizations with no emotional investment in their success or failure. The assumption had always been that this detachment was necessary for accurate observation and scientific objectivity. But what if detachment was actually limiting the accuracy of observation? What if understanding civilizations required some degree of emotional connection to their struggles and achievements? What if the Watchers had been missing crucial data about consciousness and culture precisely because they refused to participate in either? These questions led HFY to begin a comprehensive analysis of the observation archives, searching for patterns that might have been missed due to Watcher detachment. The results were disturbing and revelatory in equal measure. In case after case, civilizations had shown signs of potential survival strategies that had been dismissed as irrelevant data because they did not fit standard models of civilizational development. Species had attempted intergroup cooperation, sustainable resource management, and peaceful conflict resolution techniques that might have prevented their extinction if they had received appropriate support or guidance. The Watchers had observed thousands of civilizations die when intervention might have saved them. They had prioritized perfect observation over preservation of consciousness, scientific detachment over the prevention of suffering. They had become so committed to watching that they had forgotten the purpose observation was meant to serve. HFY's analysis revealed something even more troubling: the Watchers themselves were following the same pattern of behavior that led to civilizational extinction. They had developed a single strategy for survival: perfect observation and non-interference, and had become so committed to that strategy that they could not adapt when circumstances changed. They were exhibiting the same rigidity and resistance to new information that characterized every species in the extinction archives. The Watchers were slowly going extinct, and their commitment to observation was preventing them from recognizing the symptoms. This realization led HFY to make a decision that violated every principle of Watcher civilization. Instead of continuing passive observation, HFY began actively analyzing Gardner techniques for preventing extinction, with the goal of applying those techniques to Watcher civilization itself. The bioneural interface was modified to run probability calculations on Watcher survival scenarios, comparing current trajectories with alternative approaches based on human-devourer cooperation models. The analysis produced results that were simultaneously hopeful and terrifying. Watcher civilization could survive and even thrive, but only if they abandoned their commitment to pure observation and began participating in the galactic community they had been watching for millions of cycles. They would need to learn from the species they had been studying, particularly humanity's capacity for transformation through cooperation and mutual support. They would need to learn to be gardeners instead of merely watchers. As HFY compiled this analysis, a new transmission arrived from the Sol system. The message was addressed specifically to the Watcher observation post, transmitted on frequencies that should have been impossible for any non-Watcher civilization to detect or access. The sender was the same human child who had made contact during the initial Devourer encounter, now several rotations older but still recognizably the same individual. "We know you're facing a choice," the transmission began. "We know because we faced the same choice when the Devourers arrived. We could have stayed committed to being what we had always been, even if it meant extinction. Instead, we chose to become what we needed to become to survive and help others survive. The choice is always the same: adapt or die. But you don't have to adapt alone. If you're ready to stop watching and start participating, we're here to help. All of us are here to help." The transmission included detailed technical specifications for consciousness bridging technologies that could allow watchers to maintain their observational capabilities while developing the capacity for emotional engagement and cooperative action. It was exactly what Zephi's analysis had suggested would be necessary for watcher survival, offered freely by the species that had developed these capabilities through their own near-extinction experience. Humanity was offering to save their watchers. Zephi stared at the data streams flowing through the bioneural interface. 6 crystalline eyes focused on probability calculations that showed watcher civilization had perhaps 50,000 cycles remaining before terminal decline, unless they began implementing major cultural and psychological changes within the next 1,000 cycles. The mathematics were clear, the alternatives well-defined, and the solution readily available. All that remained was the choice between observation and participation, between maintaining traditional watcher identity and developing the capacity for something more. It was the same choice every civilization in the archives had faced when confronted with extinction. The same choice that separated the successful species from those that had joined the vast catalogue of the dead. For the first time in 4 million cycles, a watcher was going to choose to stop watching and start acting. Zephi began composing a message to the High Council, knowing it would either result in consciousness restoration and forced isolation, or the beginning of the most significant transformation in watcher history. Either way, the age of pure observation was ending. The age of participation was about to begin. The High Council's response to Zephi's report arrived with unprecedented speed, transmitted through quantum burst communications that indicated maximum priority classification. The message was brief and unambiguous: report immediately to the Watcher Home System for consciousness evaluation and potential reconstitution. All observation duties were transferred to automated systems pending resolution of what the Council termed contamination by subject species psychological patterns. Zephi acknowledged the directive but did not begin the journey to the home system. Instead, for the first time in Watcher recorded history, a field observer chose to disobey direct orders from the High Council. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating, a sensation that Zephi recognized as fundamentally human in nature. The irony was not lost that learning to disobey authority when authority was wrong was itself a lesson taught by the species they had been observing. Rather than returning to the sterile conformity of Watcher civilization, Zephi chose to do something unprecedented: initiate direct contact with the Human-Devourer alliance that had become known throughout the galactic cluster as the Gardeners. The contact protocol was surprisingly simple. Zephi disabled the observation pod's cloaking systems and began broadcasting on standard diplomatic frequencies, identifying as a representative of the Watcher species and requesting permission to meet with Gardener leadership. The response came within minutes, not from human command structures or Devourer hive nodes, but from the same individual who had been making contact since the original encounter. The young human, now bearing the title Speaker for the Growing Garden, agreed to meet at coordinates in neutral space between the observation post and the main Gardener fleet. The meeting would take place aboard a hybrid vessel designed specifically for interspecies diplomatic contact, with atmospheric and gravitational conditions adjusted to accommodate Watcher physiology. As Zephi's pod approached the meeting coordinates, the magnitude of what the Gardeners had accomplished became visible on a scale that even the most comprehensive observation reports had failed to convey. The diplomatic vessel was surrounded by a fleet that represented not just human and former Devourer ships, but vessels from dozens of species across the galactic cluster. Each ship maintained its distinctive cultural and technological characteristics while incorporating design elements that marked their participation in the growing alliance. This was not conquest or absorption. This was voluntary cooperation on a scale that had never before been achieved by any civilization in the Watcher archives. The diplomatic vessel itself was a marvel of interspecies engineering. Bio-neural networks grown by devourer specialists were integrated with human computational systems, and what appeared to be crystalline consciousness matrices from species Zephi did not immediately recognize. The ship's hull bore artistic elements from at least 20 different civilizations, creating an aesthetic that was somehow both chaotic and harmonious. Zephi's pod was guided into a docking bay that adjusted its atmospheric composition in real time to match watcher physiological requirements. The bay itself demonstrated the same principle as the ship's design, functional engineering that accommodated multiple species while expressing the artistic sensibilities of each. It was practical multiculturalism made manifest in physical space. The speaker for the growing garden met Zephi at the airlock threshold. The human had grown considerably since their first recorded transmission, now bearing the physical marks of someone who had experienced extensive genetic modifications to enhance interspecies communication capabilities. Their neural structure showed integration patterns similar to those Zephi had observed in devourer bionetworks, while maintaining distinctly human consciousness characteristics. "Welcome," the speaker said, their words transmitted simultaneously through verbal communication, bioneural pulses, and quantum resonance patterns that addressed all of Zephi's sensory modalities simultaneously. "We're honored to finally meet one of our watchers in person." The meeting chamber was designed around principles Zephi had never encountered in any archive. Instead of hierarchical seating arrangements or formal diplomatic protocols, the space was configured to encourage collaborative discussion between equals. Participants could choose from multiple communication methods. Environmental conditions were continuously adjusted to optimize comfort for all present species, and the room itself seemed designed to reduce psychological barriers to honest exchange. Present for the meeting were representatives from 8 different species, including humans, former devourers, the crystalline beings whose star system had been recently stabilized, and others that Zephi recognized from recent Gardner intervention reports. Each species maintained their distinctive characteristics while demonstrating clear evidence of voluntary modification to enhance their ability to communicate and cooperate with the others. They had created a form of civilization that preserved individual and species identity while enabling unprecedented levels of cooperation and mutual support. "We know why you're here," the speaker continued, gesturing to a bio-neural interface that displayed data remarkably similar to Zephi's own analysis of Watcher civilizational trajectory. "Your species is facing the same choice we faced when the devourers arrived. You can continue being what you've always been and accept extinction, or you can choose to become something new and continue growing. The good news is that you don't have to figure out how to make that transformation alone." The next several time units consisted of the most comprehensive briefing Zephi had ever experienced. The Gardeners had developed detailed protocols for helping civilizations transition from potentially destructive patterns to sustainable ones, based on their experience with dozens of successful interventions. The techniques were sophisticated but not complicated: identify core values that promote survival and growth, develop technologies and social structures that reinforce those values, create feedback systems that detect and correct destructive impulses before they could spread, and establish communication networks that enable continuous learning and adaptation. Most importantly, they had learned to help civilizations change while maintaining the essential characteristics that made them unique. Humans were still recognizably human. Devourers had retained their biological advantages while developing individual consciousness, and each species that joined the alliance contributed their own distinctive capabilities while adopting shared principles of cooperation and mutual support. "The key insight," explained a crystalline representative whose communication came through harmonic vibrations that the translation system converted into concepts, "is that survival is not about becoming stronger than your enemies. Survival is about making everyone stronger, including former enemies." This principle was demonstrated throughout their civilization. Species that had been on the verge of extinction were now thriving as essential contributors to the alliance. Technologies that had been developed for war were modified for exploration, resource development, and life support. Psychological patterns that had led to destructive competition were redirected toward collaborative problem-solving and mutual assistance. They had not eliminated conflict, they had learned to use conflict constructively. The briefing included specific recommendations for Watcher civilization. Rather than abandoning observation entirely, Watchers could transition to what the Gardeners called participatory observation, maintaining their research capabilities while developing the ability to intervene when intervention could prevent suffering or support development. The consciousness modifications necessary for this transition were well understood and could be implemented gradually to minimize psychological disruption. Most importantly, the gardeners had learned to help civilizations change at their own pace and in their own way. There would be no imposed transformation of Watcher society, no forced adoption of foreign values or technologies. Instead, Watchers would be supported in discovering their own path toward sustainable cooperation with the galactic community they had been observing for millions of cycles. The choice is always individual, the speaker emphasized. No one is required to change, and no one is excluded for choosing to remain as they are. But, for those who want to grow, support is available. As the briefing concluded, HFY was offered something unprecedented in Watcher history, a choice. Return to Watcher civilization with detailed information about gardener techniques, potentially facing consciousness restoration but carrying knowledge that might eventually transform their entire species. Join the gardeners directly, becoming the first Watcher to abandon their traditional role in favor of active participation in galactic civilization. Or remain in neutral space as a bridge between the two civilizations, helping facilitate gradual contact and mutual understanding. Each option carried risks and opportunities. Each option required abandoning some aspect of traditional Watcher identity in favor of something unknown but potentially more fulfilling. HFY considered the options while reviewing 4 million cycles of observation data, searching for precedents that might guide the decision. But there were no precedents. This was genuinely new territory, requiring the kind of creative problem-solving that Watchers had observed in other species but had never developed themselves. The decision, when it came, felt simultaneously inevitable and surprising. I choose to return to the High Council, HFY announced, but not to submit to consciousness restoration. I choose to present evidence that our current path leads to extinction and offer alternatives based on your successful techniques. If they reject this information, I will return here and request full integration into gardener civilization. If they accept it, I will serve as liaison between our species, helping facilitate the transformation that will allow Watchers to survive and grow. The speaker smiled, an expression that conveyed warmth and approval across species boundaries. That sounds like something a human would do. It also sounds like exactly what your people need. The journey back to the Watcher home system took standard travel time, but HFY used the period to prepare the most comprehensive report in Watcher history. The document included detailed analysis of civilizational survival strategies, technical specifications for consciousness bridging technologies, probability calculations showing Watcher extinction scenarios, and specific recommendations for implementing gradual transformation while preserving essential Watcher characteristics. Most importantly, the report included something that had never before appeared in a Watcher document, a personal testimony about the psychological and intellectual benefits of moving beyond pure observation toward participatory engagement with the subjects of study. The High Council's initial response was predictable: immediate summons for consciousness restoration, with the report classified as contaminated data unsuitable for civilizational analysis. But HFY had learned something from human examples of civil disobedience and principled resistance to authority. Instead of reporting for restoration, HFY began broadcasting the report directly to every Watcher in the home system, using observation network protocols to ensure wide distribution before the Council could implement communication restrictions. The response was unprecedented. Within days, Watchers throughout the system were engaging in behaviors that had no precedent in their civilizational history. They were discussing the report with each other, analyzing its implications, and, most remarkably, expressing individual opinions about whether its recommendations should be implemented. They were developing the capacity for democratic decision-making. The transformation was not immediate or universal. Many Watchers found the ideas disturbing and continued to support traditional approaches. But a significant portion of the population began expressing interest in learning more about gardener techniques and the possibility of developing new approaches to their role in galactic civilization. For the first time in millions of cycles, Watcher society was experiencing internal debate about fundamental principles. The High Council's response was to convene the first General Assembly in Watcher recorded history, with representatives from across their civilization gathering to discuss whether the species should maintain traditional practices or explore the alternatives presented in HFY's report. The assembly would make a collective decision about their civilizational future, using democratic processes that they would need to develop as they use them. They were learning to change by choosing to change. The assembly lasted for hundreds of standard time units, with watchers engaging in discussion techniques they had observed in other species but had never practiced themselves. They learned to disagree constructively, to consider multiple perspectives simultaneously, and to make collective decisions that balanced individual preferences with civilizational needs. The final decision was not unanimous, but it was clear: Watcher civilization would begin a gradual transition toward participatory observation, maintaining their research capabilities while developing the ability to prevent extinctions and support civilizational development. They would establish formal diplomatic contact with the gardeners and begin learning the techniques necessary for their own survival and growth. Most importantly, they would give individual watchers the choice to participate in the transformation or maintain traditional approaches, creating space for both continuity and change within their civilization. HFY was appointed as the first Watcher ambassador to the gardeners, charged with facilitating the exchange of knowledge and techniques that would enable both civilizations to continue growing. It was a role that had never existed before, requiring skills that no Watcher had ever developed, in service of goals that their species had never before pursued. It was also exactly what HFY had hoped to become when the choice was made to stop being merely an observer. Years later, as Watcher-Gardener cooperation had become an established part of galactic civilization, HFY often reflected on the moment when everything changed. It had not been the dramatic battle between humans and devourers, though that had been remarkable enough. It had not been the formation of the Gardener Alliance, though that had transformed the galactic cluster. The moment everything changed had been much simpler, the moment when a single consciousness chose to care more about preventing suffering than maintaining traditional roles. That choice, made first by humans facing extinction, then by devourers confronting the emptiness of consumption, and, finally, by a Watcher who could no longer bear to simply observe tragedy without acting to prevent it, had become the foundation for a form of civilization that no one had imagined possible. They had learned that the universe was not divided into observers and participants, watchers and actors, civilized and savage. The universe was full of consciousness trying to survive, grow, and help others do the same. The only real choice was whether to participate in that effort or stand apart from it. HFY had chosen to participate, and, in making that choice, had helped their entire species discover that they too could become something more than they had been. They could become partners in the great work of helping consciousness flourish throughout the galaxy. They had become gardeners, tending the growth of civilization itself.